The candle had burned down to a stub by the time Rafe Callum set the pen back on the table. The paper in front of him was the fourth he had started that evening. The others lay crumpled near the leg of the chair, each one abandoned after a sentence or two, each one failing in a different way. The first had been too formal, reading more like a land agreement than anything a person would send to another person. The second had gone too far in the other direction, soft words that felt dishonest the moment he read them back. The third, he had not even finished. He had simply stopped in the middle of a sentence, looked at what he was doing, and felt something close to embarrassment, though there was no one in the room to witness it. The fourth said only this: "I am not looking for love. I have a son who needs someone to stay. I can offer a home, honest work, and fair treatment. I will not pretend to be more than I am." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it before he could change his mind and pressed the wax seal down hard, the way a man closes a door he is not certain should be opened at all. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like water, and the land stretched away from the house in every direction, flat and wide and indifferent, the kind of country that made small troubles feel smaller and large ones feel permanent. The sky above Grey Hollow was always doing something worth watching, even in the dark. Tonight it was deep and layered, clouds moving fast across a moon that kept disappearing and coming back. Rafe stood from the table and carried the letter to the shelf near the door, where it would wait until morning. He did not linger over it. That was not his way. A decision made was a decision made, and standing there staring at it would not change what it said. He walked to the window instead. Eli was in the yard. The boy sat near the old water trough with his back against it, talking to the dog in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that a child uses when he believes no one can hear. The dog, a brown and gray mutt named Pocket, who had arrived at the ranch 3 summers ago and simply declined to leave, lay with his chin on Eli's knee and his eyes half closed. The boy's hand moved through the dog's fur in slow, absent strokes. Rafe watched his son for a long moment. Eli was 11 years old. He had his mother's eyes, green-gray and quick, always taking in more than he let on. He had Rafe's silences, the ones that settled into a room and filled it without making a sound. He had been a talker once, back when he was very small, back when the house had more than 2 people in it. These days he chose his words carefully, the way a man chooses where to step on uncertain ground. Rafe had told him 3 years ago, in a voice he kept steady only through considerable effort, that his mother was not coming back. Eli had looked at him for a long moment and then had nodded, a single slow nod, and said nothing at all. That nod had stayed with Rafe longer than any of the anger or grief that came after. A child should not know how to absorb that kind of news so quietly. A child should cry, or rage, or ask why. Eli had simply nodded, as if somewhere beneath all the hoping he had already been preparing for exactly this. That was 3 years ago. Eli was still preparing. Rafe turned from the window and picked up the letter from the shelf. He looked at it one more time. Then he set it back down. He was not certain this would help. He was not even certain it was the right thing. But he was certain of one thing, and had been for some time now. A boy who had already lost one person to leaving needed something in his life that stayed. Rafe could give him the land and the horses and the work. He could not give him what he did not have to offer. He had already given most of that away to someone who had not wanted it, and what was left had gone into the ground with things he did not speak about. He would send the letter in the morning. He would be honest about what he was. And he would let that be enough. The train came in from the east, the way everything eventually came to Gray Hollow, trailing dust and the smell of coal smoke, and the particular exhaustion of a long journey across open country. It arrived at midday, when the sun was at its most direct and the platform boards were hot enough to feel through the soles of a shoe. Vera Ashwood had been on the train for 2.5 days. She sat near the window for the last hour of the journey, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the land passing outside. The dry, golden grass, the scattered rock formations that rose from the plain like the remnants of something older. The occasional cluster of buildings that appeared and then fell behind before she could fully take them in. She had not slept well on the train. She had not slept well in a great while, if she was being truthful with herself, and she was trying harder these days to be truthful with herself, it being one of the few reliable tools she had left. Her traveling bag was in the rack above her. It was not a large bag. She had learned over the past 2 years to travel light, or rather, she had been taught it, incrementally, by a man who had a talent for making a woman understand that she owned less than she thought. In the bag, wrapped in a gray wool cloth, and wedged between a spare dress and her winter coat, was a small notebook. The cover was worn smooth from handling, the pages thick and slightly wavy from age. Her father had kept it his whole working life, filling it in his small, careful hand with what he knew about plants and healing, which roots to dry and how, which leaves to steep and at what temperature, what a particular color or smell in a wound might mean. He had given it to her the year she married, pressing it into her hands with the quiet gravity of a man passing on the only fortune he had to give. She had nearly left it behind when she packed. Doyle had stood in the doorway watching, his arms crossed, his expression doing the thing it always did, that particular arrangement of features that was not quite a sneer and not quite a smile, and communicated very precisely that he found the entire proceeding unnecessary and slightly contemptible. She had put the notebook in the bag last, after everything else, when his attention had shifted briefly to something outside the window. Small rebellions. That had been her life for 2 years. Small rebellions, carefully timed. The train slowed. The station at Gray Hollow was not much to speak of. A platform and a building with a peaked roof and a hand-painted sign that had weathered down to near illegibility. There was a wagon road leading away from it into the town proper, and beyond the town the land opened up again into that same wide, quiet country she had been watching all morning. Vera stood and retrieved her bag from the rack. Her legs were stiff. Her back ached in the particular way that came from sitting in the same position too long without permission to change it. She straightened up, squared her shoulders the way her mother had taught her, and followed the other passengers toward the door. The platform was warm and bright and smelled of horses and iron and dry wood. She stepped off the last stair and stopped, letting the other passengers move around her, and looked. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform. Her eyes found him without much difficulty, because he was the one standing still. He was taller than she had expected, though she did not know why she had expected anything. The letter had said nothing about his height. He had dark hair, going gray at the temples, and the kind of weathered look that came not from age alone, but from long years of work in the sun. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand, not raised, just held, at his side. He was looking toward the train with the expression of a man who has committed to a course of action and is seeing it through without ceremony. When his eyes found hers, neither of them moved for a moment. Then Vera walked toward him, and he did not look away. "You had a long trip," he said. It was not quite a question. "Long enough to think," she said. He looked at her with something careful in his expression, something that was taking stock without being unkind. Then he reached down and picked up her traveling bag from beside her feet without asking whether she wanted him to, and turned toward the wagon road. She followed. At the edge of the platform, beside the wagon, a boy stood with his arms at his sides. He was slight for his age, with serious eyes that moved to Vera the moment she came into view, and stayed there, not with hostility, but with the unblinking attention of someone conducting a careful assessment. Vera paused. She looked at the boy. He looked back. She shifted her weight and lowered herself slightly, not quite to his level, but closer to it, and said, "Would you like to shake hands?" The boy looked at her hand. He looked at her face. Then he walked to the wagon and climbed up into the seat without a word. Behind her, she heard nothing. No apology, no explanation. She straightened back up and found Rafe standing a few feet away, his jaw set, his eyes on his son's back. Something moved across his face that was brief and heavy, and then gone. She did not comment on it. She climbed up into the wagon herself and settled her bag between her feet and watched Grey Hollow go past them as the horse moved down the road. They did not speak much on the drive out to the ranch. Rafe offered occasional observations about the land they were passing through, the name of a ridge, the direction of the water, which section of fence needed attention before winter. Practical information, the kind of thing a man says when he is trying to establish what something is before he has to decide what it means. Vera listened and asked a question or two, and let the silence between the words rest without trying to fill it. The ranch came into view around a long bend, and her first impression was of space. The house was not large, but it sat at the center of a wide yard with the particular settled quality of a thing that had been in place long enough to belong to the ground beneath it. The barn stood to one side, its roof solid, its doors open to the afternoon light. The pasture stretched beyond, green at the edges where water ran and dry gold everywhere else. It was not beautiful in a pretty way. It was beautiful in the way that honest things sometimes are. The room he showed her to was on the east side of the house. It had a window that looked out over the pasture. The floor was clean. The bed had been made with care. The blanket straight and the pillow set square. The lock on the door was new. Its brass, still bright, obviously installed recently. She noticed that without remarking on it. There was nothing decorative in the room. No curtain, no rug, no small object set out to make it feel welcoming. She did not find this cold. She found it honest, which was more than she had often had lately. She set her bag down on the bed. She looked at the window for a moment, at the light moving across the dry grass outside. Then she saw it, in the far corner of the windowsill, sitting against the wooden frame where the light caught it. A small horse, carved from wood, painted in colors that had mostly worn away. One ear was chipped. The tail was smooth from years of being held. It was not something that had been placed there for a guest. It was something that had been left behind, or perhaps not quite put away, and had come to rest in a quiet corner the way objects do when a house has been mostly a man's house and a boy's house for long enough. Vera looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up carefully and set it on the windowsill where it would catch the afternoon light, and went downstairs. Dinner was quiet. Eli ate steadily and said nothing. Rafe passed things without being asked. There was bread, and there was stew, and there was the sound of wind against the side of the house, which was the sound the evenings made here, she was beginning to understand. A low, consistent presence that was not unpleasant once you stopped expecting silence. After, when the dishes had been cleared and Eli had gone upstairs with a brief and wordless departure, Rafe sat back down at the table with 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her side without ceremony. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want to say what I mean," he said, "before we get further along and one of us has the wrong idea." "All right," Vera said. "I'm not looking for what most people mean when they say a wife." He said it the way a man recites something he has rehearsed enough times that it has lost its roughness, but not quite its weight. "I have a boy who lost something he shouldn't have had to lose. I need someone who's willing to be here long enough that he stops waiting for the next person to go." Vera held her cup with both hands and said nothing. "I can offer a fair arrangement," he said. "You'll have your own room, your own hours, within reason. I won't make demands that aren't agreed on. I'll treat you decently." He paused. "That's what I can promise. I'm not going to promise more than that, because I don't have more than that to give." Vera looked at him. She thought about Doyle standing in the doorway watching her pack, his arms crossed, his expression arranged into that practiced form of contempt. She thought about the 2 years before this one, the slow and steady accumulation of small losses, the way a person could be present in a house every day and still manage to become invisible by degrees. She thought about the notebook in her bag upstairs and what it had cost to keep it. "I don't want you to pretend to care about me," she said. "I've had enough of people performing things they don't feel. If we're honest with each other about what this is, I think we'll get along fine." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I think we do," she said. They did not shake hands. They both simply returned to their coffee, and the wind moved against the house, and somewhere upstairs a floorboard settled, and that was the beginning of the arrangement. She woke in the dark. It was not the wind that woke her, though the wind was still there, a constant low note against the window glass. It was something quieter than that, something she had to hold her breath to hear. From the room beside hers, through the wall that separated them, came the sound of a child trying very hard not to cry. It was a particular sound, that kind of crying. Not the open crying of a young child who has not yet learned to hide it, but the held, careful crying of one who has decided that tears are a private thing, to be managed privately, and released only in the furthest hours of the night, when no one should be listening. It was a sound she knew. She had made it herself often enough to recognize it in someone else. Vera lay still for a moment, listening. Then she got up quietly and walked to the door of her room. She stood in the dark hall. The door to Eli's room was shut. No light came from under it. She stood there with one hand resting against the wall and considered what a person ought to do in this situation, what was helpful and what was intrusive, what a child who had learned not to trust might need, and what he might only find threatening. She did not knock. She did not go in. She sat down on the floor in the hall, her back against the wall beside his door, and pulled her knees up slightly, and in a voice low enough that it might have been meant for no one, she began to tell a story. It was one her father had told her, A story about a horse that could not find its herd and traveled a long distance across difficult country, not because it knew where it was going, but because standing still felt worse than moving. She kept her voice quiet and even, like water over smooth stone, unhurried, with no particular feeling pushed into it beyond the simple forward motion of one word following another. Behind the door, the sound she had been hearing faded. By the time she reached the end of the story, she could hear only breathing, slow and deep. She waited another minute, then stood up carefully and went back to her room. She did not sleep for a long time after that. She lay on her back in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and looked at the ceiling and thought about the small wooden horse sitting on the windowsill across the room, catching no light now, just sitting in the dark the way things do when no one is watching. She had not come here looking for this. But something in the house, something in the tired bones of it, in the careful lock on her door, and the boy's controlled silence, and the man's rehearsed honesty at the kitchen table, was asking a question she had not been asked in a very long time. Not what can you do? Not what do you owe? Simply, will you stay? She did not yet know the answer. She was not sure it was fair to ask it of herself so soon. But she lay in the dark and let the question rest there, unhurried, the way her father's stories always ended, not with resolution, but with the quiet sense that there was still road ahead. And outside the window, the wind moved through the grass of Grey Hollow, and the land held its shape against the dark. And in the room beside hers, a boy slept without dreaming of leaving. The first week passed the way first weeks often do in a new place, carefully, with everyone on their best behavior and no one quite at ease. Vera learned the shape of the days quickly. Rafe was up before the light, out to the barn before she came downstairs, back in for breakfast with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had been running a household alone long enough that he had stopped noticing the silence in it. Eli came down after his father, ate without speaking, and was out the door and across the yard before Vera had finished her second cup of coffee. He had a way of disappearing that was not exactly avoidance. It was more like a habit, the habit of a creature that had learned to take up as little space as possible, not because anyone had told it to, but because small things are harder to lose. Vera did not push. She had learned something about pushing and what it cost, and she had no intention of spending that particular coin here. She learned the kitchen first. It was a good kitchen, well-proportioned, with a cast-iron stove that required specific management and a pantry that Rafe had stocked with the practical thoroughness of someone who understood winters. The shelves held flour and cornmeal and dried beans and things preserved in summer that would matter come the cold months. There was order to it, but no ease. The kind of order that gets established when a person is doing everything necessary and nothing more. When function has taken the place of comfort because comfort requires a reason. She cooked the first few meals simply, nothing that required comment, and took note of what Eli ate and what he left. He ate bread without hesitation. He was cautious about anything he didn't recognize. He liked things with salt and was indifferent to sweet. Small data, carefully collected. Rafe ate whatever was put in front of him and said, "Thank you," in the same tone he said most things, even, unhurried, carrying neither warmth nor its absence. The first time he said it, she thought it was reflex. By the third time, she understood it was deliberate. He was a man who kept his word, even the small ones, especially the small ones. At the end of the first week, she found the ledger. It was on the shelf in the small room off the kitchen that served as an office, sitting on top of a stack of papers with no particular attempt to hide it. She had been looking for a pencil. She found the pencil and the ledger at the same time, and she almost put it back, but something in the columns of numbers caught her eye in the way that misaligned things catch the eye of someone who has spent enough time with figures to recognize when they are telling the wrong story. She stood in the doorway of the little office and turned pages for 10 minutes. It was not dishonesty. It was not even carelessness, exactly. It was the kind of cumulative drift that happened when one person had been doing the work of three for too long, when the entries got made at the end of long days by a tired hand, when small errors folded into each other across seasons and years until the picture they painted was subtly, persistently wrong. She could see the pattern of it. She could also see what it was hiding, inadvertently, from the man who thought he understood the state of his own land. She put the ledger back. She found a clean sheet of paper and sharpened the pencil and sat down at the kitchen table after dinner, when Rafe had gone back out to see to the horses and Eli was upstairs, and she worked through the numbers the way her father had taught her, slowly, from the bottom up, checking each thing against the thing before it. It took most of the evening. By the time she heard Rafe's boots on the porch, she had set the corrected figures to one side and put the original ledger back on its shelf and was sitting with her hands around a cooling cup of tea, looking at nothing in particular. He came in and stopped when he saw her at the table. She said nothing about the ledger. Not that night. In the morning, she put the corrected sheet on the shelf beside it, where he would find it when he went in. She did not explain it. She went out to the garden and began the work she had been planning for the east bed, which was overrun and needed a full day's attention. She did not hear him find it. She did not look toward the house. At noon she came in to start the midday meal and found on the kitchen table, placed with no ceremony at all, a bundle of plants pulled from the ground with their roots still on. 3 different kinds, all of them things she had been looking for since she arrived, things that grew wild in this country, but that she had not yet had time to locate on the property. One of them she had mentioned once in passing, to no one in particular, in the context of the calf she had been watching since her second day here. She stood looking at the bundle for a moment. Then she picked it up and went to find what she needed. The calf was in the far end of the barn, separated from the others because Rafe had noticed 3 days ago that it was favoring its right foreleg and had isolated it as a matter of course, the way a careful man manages an unknown problem. The leg was not broken. She had known that from her first examination. It was a soft tissue injury, the kind that healed on its own given time and the right support, but healed faster and cleaner with proper treatment. She had been managing it with what she had. Now she had more. She worked steadily in the dim warmth of the barn, talking to the calf in the low, unhurried voice that animals responded to, not because of the words, but because of the quality of the sound. The evidence of a calm presence that meant no harm. The calf had stopped flinching from her hands 2 days ago. Today it stood quietly and let her work. She did not hear Rafe come in. When she turned around, he was standing in the entrance to the stall, one shoulder against the post, watching. Not the calf. Her. She met his eyes. He did not look away. She turned back to the calf and finished what she was doing, cleaning her hands on the cloth she had brought and rising from her crouch with the deliberate care of someone whose knees had been on hard ground long enough. He said nothing. She said nothing. She gathered her things and walked past him out of the stall and back toward the house, and she was almost to the barn door when she heard him say it, quietly, behind her. Thank you. She stopped walking, did not turn around. I told you, she said. That's not necessary. A brief silence, then his voice again, still quiet, but with something in it that had not been there before. A weight, a slight shift in register. That's not what I'm thanking you for. She stood there for a moment longer, then she went back to the house. That evening, he put a tin cup of coffee in front of her without asking, the same way he did for himself, without offering, without making it a gesture. Just a cup on the table in the right place at the right time. She noticed. She said nothing about it, but she noticed. The morning Eli brought the wooden horse back was a Thursday. She was in the kitchen when she heard the sound on the stairs, the particular rhythm of a child trying to descend quietly and not quite managing it. She kept her hands in the bread she was working and did not turn around. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She could feel him there the way you feel weather, a presence with its own atmosphere, its own uncertainty about what it intended to do. She turned the bread, added pressure with the heel of her palm, let the silence sit. Then there was the small sound of something being set on the kitchen table. She looked, finally, and the wooden horse was there, placed at the near edge of the table with its chipped ear toward her and its painted flank catching the morning light that came through the east window. Eli was already retreating, already halfway to the back door, already becoming the boy who had not quite been there. It's yours, he said, without turning around, and went outside. Vera looked at the horse for a long moment. She dried her hands on her apron, slowly. She picked up the small carved figure and held it, feeling the smoothness where years of small hands had polished the wood to a kind of warmth. She set it on the kitchen windowsill where it would be visible from both inside and out. Then she went back to her bread. She did not cry. But it was a near thing. Maud Rennie came on a Wednesday, near the end of the second week, arriving in the way that Maud Rennie apparently arrived everywhere, without particular announcement, with a dish covered in a cloth, and with the focused interest of a woman who considered it her civic responsibility to know the internal condition of every household within a reasonable radius of her own. She was perhaps 60, with sharp eyes behind small glasses, and the kind of angular face that age had made more itself rather than less. She had known Rafe since he was young, she informed Vera, as if this gave her a certain jurisdiction. She set her dish on the table and looked around the kitchen with the frank assessment of a woman who has seen many kitchens and knows what they reveal. You've made some changes, she said. Small ones, Vera said. The window was always too dark in here. That curtain he had was doing no one any favors. Maud sat down in the chair nearest the window as if she had sat in it before, which perhaps she had. You're settling in, then? Getting my bearings, Vera said. Maud looked at her over the tops of her glasses. How much do you know about what happened with his wife? Vera poured tea and set a cup in front of the older woman. What he chose to tell me, she said carefully, which was probably very little. Maud wrapped both hands around the cup. She left. I expect he told you that much. What he likely didn't tell you is that she said a great deal on her way out, to anyone who would listen. She paused, letting that sit. She said he was cold, that he didn't know how to be with people, that he was better suited to his cattle than to a family. Another pause. She said it in a way that got repeated. Small towns have long memories. Vera looked at the woman across the table. Why are you telling me this? Maud regarded her with something that might have been approval. Because you should know what he's been carrying. And because I'm curious whether you're the kind of woman who runs toward that kind of information or away from it. Vera thought about that for a moment. I think, she said, that a person who has been told enough times that they are a particular way will eventually start to act as if it's true, whether it is or not. Maud was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Yes." They drank their tea. Maud asked about the calf and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. She told Vera 2 things about the property that turned out to be useful. The location of a spring on the south end that ran clean through summer, and a particular patch of ground near the northern fence line where certain plants grew that did not grow elsewhere on the ranch. She left an hour later with the same lack of ceremony with which she had arrived. At the door, she stopped and looked back at Vera with those sharp eyes. "He's not cold," she said. "He's just careful. There's a difference." She put her hat on. "Though I will say, you don't look like someone who plans to be here long." The words landed with the precision of something well aimed. "What does that look like?" Vera asked. Maud considered her. "Like someone who hasn't put anything up yet. Like someone who's still facing the door." She left before Vera could respond. Vera stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of the wagon had faded. Then she went to the windowsill where the wooden horse stood and adjusted it, turned it slightly so it faced inward toward the room. A small thing, but deliberate. Doyle Ashwood appeared on a Friday. Vera saw him before he saw her, which was the only advantage she had, and she used it completely, stepping back from the open window of the tack room where she had been working and pressing herself against the wall, her hand flat against the rough wood, her breathing steady through effort alone. He was at the other end of the main street of Gray Hollow, outside the general store, shaking hands with a man she did not know. He was smiling the way he smiled when he was in acquisition mode, open and warm and entirely constructed. The smile of a man who understood that people extended goodwill to people who appeared to be extending it first. She knew that smile the way she knew the sound of her own name. It had been aimed at her often enough before she understood what it was. He had not seen her. He was not looking this direction. He was engaged with the man in front of him with his full performance of attention, the performance that meant he was being charming, which meant he was being useful to himself. Vera walked back through the tack room and out the other side and did not look down the street again. On the drive back to the ranch, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same way she had sat on the train, and let the land pass around her and worked at keeping her breathing level. Pocket, who had taken to riding in the back of the wagon when permitted, sat behind her with his chin on the sideboard and his ears up, watching the road. She had known this was possible. She had known it when she packed the bag, when she climbed onto the train, when she gave her name at the station in the voice she had practiced for that purpose, clear and even, no tremor. She had known that the distance between her and Doyle Ashwood was a wagon road and 2 days' travel, which was not very much distance at all. What she had not known, not with any certainty, was how she would feel when the distance closed. Now she knew. She felt tired. Not afraid, not exactly, though fear was part of it. Mostly she felt tired in the way of someone who has been running long enough that the running itself has become a kind of weight. She did not tell Rafe that evening. She told herself she was waiting until she understood the shape of it better, until she knew what Doyle was doing here and what it meant. This was partially true. The other part she did not examine very closely. What she did notice, 3 days later, was that Rafe had been staying closer to the house than usual. He did not say anything about it. He did not change what he was doing, only where he was doing it. The fence work that had been on the south end of the property was now happening within sight of the yard. The horse he was training was being worked in the near pasture rather than the far one. He did not explain this, and she did not ask. She thought about what Maud had said. He's not cold. He's just careful. She watched him from the kitchen window for a moment, the way he moved through his work, deliberate and unhurried, nothing wasted. Then she went back to what she was doing. That evening, a sudden hard rain came in off the high ground, and the roof above the back room began to leak in 2 places. The kind of leak that had been waiting patiently for exactly this amount of rain to make itself known. She found the buckets. Rafe came in from the barn and found 2 patches of ceiling he'd clearly known were problems and hadn't gotten to. And his expression when he saw them was the expression of a man confronting his own neglect without excuse. They worked in the lamplight, moving furniture, setting down more cloth, testing the edges of the damage. He went up to the roof, access with tools, and she held the lamp below, and they communicated in the shorthand of 2 people managing a problem together, not with warmth, but with a kind of synchrony that was its own thing, quieter and possibly more useful. When the worst of it was addressed and the rain had settled into a steady, lighter sound on the repaired section, they ended up sitting at the kitchen table with wet shoulders and the particular unwound feeling that comes after a shared emergency that turned out to be manageable. He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, sat down. She looked at his hands around his cup, roughened and large, with the particular distribution of callus and wear that came from specific work, this kind of grip on this kind of tool. She looked at them with the same attention she gave things she was trying to understand, without agenda, just observation. He noticed. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not guarded exactly, but close to it. The look of someone aware of being read and uncertain how they feel about it. She said the first thing that came into her head, which was, "Does your hand bother you, the left one? You favor it differently." He looked down at his left hand as if he had forgotten it was there. "Old injury. Not often." "I have something that helps with that," she said, "if you want." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She got up and found what she needed from the shelf where she'd been slowly organizing her supplies, and came back and sat across from him. He put his left hand on the table, palm up, with the slight self-consciousness of a man not accustomed to being tended to, and she worked the preparation into the joint with her thumbs, feeling where the stiffness lived, working slowly. His hand was very still. She focused on what she was doing. The rain continued outside, lighter now, and the lamp made a warm circle of light on the table, and their hands in the middle of it. She finished and sat back. He closed his hand slowly, testing it. "Thank you," he said. "You said that already." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I meant it both times." The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Not empty, not careful. It was the kind of silence that forms when something has been established that did not exist an hour ago, when the air in a room has shifted slightly on its axis, and neither person has named it yet, and both know it, and neither is ready. He said, "You don't have to tell me what's worrying you, but I'd like you to know that you can." She looked at him. "I've noticed you watching the road," he said. Simply, no accusation in it, no demand. Just the observation of a man who had been paying attention. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain made its steady sound against the window glass. "Not yet," she said. "I'm not ready yet." He nodded. Once, the way he nodded at things that were settled. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. The lamp burned steadily between them, and across the kitchen, the small wooden horse stood on the windowsill with its face toward the room. And upstairs, Eli slept without making a sound, and the rain came down over Gray Hollow like a curtain drawn gently across the end of something and the beginning of something else. 3 days after the rain, Eli got sick. It came on fast, the way fevers do with children, fine in the morning and burning by afternoon, the color gone from his face, and the light gone from his eyes, and his whole small body surrendered to the particular helplessness of illness that no amount of stubbornness can argue with. Rafe carried him upstairs with a face like stone, the kind of stone that is stone because it cannot afford to be anything else, and set him in his bed and stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at his son with an expression that Vera did not look at directly because it felt too private. She went to her room for her notebook. She came back with what she needed. She worked efficiently and quietly. No flourish to it. Just the practical movement of someone who knew what to do and was doing it. Cool cloths and the right preparations and the management of temperature and rest. The accumulated knowledge of her father's life applied to the small, urgent fact of this boy. Rafe did not leave the room for the first hour. He sat in the chair in the corner, not speaking, not interfering, watching Vera work with the clenched attention of a man who was not accustomed to being the one who could only wait. She was aware of him there the whole time, the way you are aware of weather, and she moved around his presence without difficulty, including him in nothing that didn't require him, excluding him from nothing that did. Deep in the night, when the fever had eased a little and Eli's breathing had evened out into sleep, the boy made a sound. Not words, exactly. The half-formed sounds of someone dreaming, following the logic of a story that was only his, but in the middle of it, clearly, in the particular soft voice of a child who is very young inside his dream, he said, "Don't go." The room went absolutely still. Vera was at the bedside. Rafe was behind her, she knew, in the chair or standing. She didn't turn to check. She looked at Eli's face, slack and peaceful now, his chest rising and falling with the slow, deep rhythm of real sleep. She heard, behind her, the sound of Rafe's hand gripping the back of the chair. A small sound. The sound of something held very tight. She didn't turn around. She reached out and adjusted the cloth on Eli's forehead with deliberate care, smoothing it at the edges with her fingers, giving her hand something to do, and herself somewhere to look. And then she felt it. The weight of Rafe's hand settling onto her shoulder. Not a grip, not pressure, just the flat of his palm resting there, the way a man might rest a hand on a fence post or a door frame. Something solid, something that is simply there. She felt the warmth of it through the cloth of her dress, and she went very still. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the night was quiet over the land of Gray Hollow, and the lamp burned low, and Eli slept, and the hand on her shoulder stayed there, heavy and honest, for a long time. When she finally turned, hours later, to tell him that the boy was through the worst of it and would be well by morning, Rafe was sitting in the chair with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not crying, not sleeping, just folded inward for a moment in the way of someone who has been holding something a very long time and allowed himself, briefly, to set it down. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. Then she went downstairs and put the kettle on. She was still standing there when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, and then his shape in the kitchen doorway, and she turned and he looked at her in the lamplight. This man who had told her at a kitchen table what he could and could not promise. This man whose careful hands had placed a bundle of plants where she would find them without making it into anything. This man who had pressed his palm to her shoulder in the dark because there was nothing else to say, and it was the most honest thing available. She poured the coffee and set his cup down and sat across from him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because the thing that had happened in that room upstairs was too new and too real and too much like the beginning of something neither of them had agreed to be ready for. But the cups were there, and the lamplight was there, and the arrangement they had signed in words was quietly, irrevocably, changing into something that did not yet have a name. Eli recovered the way children do, faster than seemed reasonable, faster than the adults around him had recovered from watching him be sick. By the second morning, he was sitting up and asking for bread. By the third, he was downstairs, quieter than usual but present, moving through the kitchen with the slightly careful quality of someone who has been reminded that their body has limits and is choosing, for the moment, to respect them. Vera watched him come down the stairs that third morning and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not fully acknowledged was tight. He came to the kitchen table and sat in his usual chair, and she set bread in front of him without comment. He ate. She moved around the kitchen doing the morning's work. Outside, the light was early and pale, the kind of light that came before the sun fully committed to the day, and through the window the land was still and gold and very quiet. Then Eli put his hand over hers. Not a grip, just his small hand, placed flat on top of hers where it rested on the table. He was looking at the bread, not at her. His face was entirely neutral, the particular neutrality of a child who is doing something significant and has decided to do it as if it were ordinary so that it can be taken back if necessary. Vera went still. She did not move her hand. She did not speak. She simply let his hand rest on hers and kept her breathing even and looked at the window and the pale morning light coming through it. And she thought about her father and his notebook and the long, careful years of learning that some things could not be rushed, that some things could only be waited for, that patience was not passivity, but its own kind of action. After a moment, Eli took his hand back and finished his bread and went outside. Vera stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, watching him cross the yard toward the barn where the young horses were kept, his stride more certain than it had been 3 days ago, the morning light making a long shadow of him across the pale dust of the yard. She heard Rafe on the stairs. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. She did not turn around, but she knew he had seen. She knew from the quality of the silence behind her, which was different from his ordinary silences, weighted in a particular way, heavier in some places and very careful in others. He did not say anything. He went to the stove and poured his coffee and went outside, and she heard his boots cross the porch, and then the yard, following, at a greater distance, the path his son had taken. She turned from the window only when both of them were out of sight. That evening, Maud Rennie's information about the plants proved itself. A rider came to the ranch in the late afternoon, a young man from one of the outlying properties, his horse lathered and his face tight with the particular expression of someone managing fear through action. 3 animals sick on his family's land, the same presentation she had been hearing about in fragments for the past week. The weakness in the hindquarters, the labored breathing, the refusal of feed. His father had lost 2 head to it the season before, and was not willing to lose more. Vera went to her shelf. She asked him 3 questions about the animals and listened to the answers, and confirmed what she had already suspected. She gave him what she had prepared and told him how to administer it and what to watch for and when to come back if it wasn't working. She spoke clearly and without hedging, the way her father had spoken, the way she had learned to speak about things she actually knew. The young man looked at her with the slightly startled expression of someone who had arrived expecting to be tolerated and was being taken seriously instead. He left with his horse at a more measured pace than he had arrived. 2 days later, he came back to say all 3 animals were improving. Word moved through Grey Hollow the way word moves through small places, with speed and without much friction. By the end of that week, she had been to 4 other properties. She charged nothing and accepted what was offered, which was sometimes food and sometimes help with a fence post, and once, from a woman who had no other currency, the recipe for a particular kind of preserved plum that was apparently famous in her family for reasons she explained at some length. At each place, she listened and observed and referred to her father's notebook when necessary, without apology and without performance. She was not building a reputation. She was just doing what she knew how to do. The reputation built itself, the way true things tend to do, quietly and without requiring management. Rafe noticed. She knew because the things he left on the table for her had become more specific over time, calibrated to what she needed next rather than what she had needed last, which meant he had been paying close attention to the work itself and not just its results. She did not point this out. He did not explain it. But there was a language developing between them that had no words in it, a language of small, precise actions that said, "I see what you are doing, and I am paying attention, and this is what I can contribute." And she understood that language in her bones in a way she had not understood anything for a very long time, because it required nothing performed and nothing pretended, only the plain evidence of what each of them actually was. Doyle Ashwood came to the ranch on a Thursday. He came alone, which was worse in a way than if he had come with company. Company would have meant a particular kind of confrontation, the kind with edges and defined positions. Alone, he was the version of himself she had always found harder to navigate, the version that could modulate, that could be genial or reasonable or merely present, all in the service of the same purpose, delivered in the register that seemed most likely to succeed. She saw the horse at the gate from the kitchen window, and she had one moment, just one, where she stood with her hand on the windowsill and felt the old weight of him, not fear of physical harm, but something subtler and in some ways worse, the particular dread of someone who had spent 2 years being slowly convinced that her own perceptions were unreliable. Then she dried her hands and went to the door. He was still at the gate. He had not come to the porch, which was itself information. He was reading the property, the way he always read a place before he entered it, assessing what it was and what it could be made to be. When he saw her, he smiled. "Vera," he said, as if they had seen each other last week, as if everything between them had been a series of minor misunderstandings now smoothed over by the passage of time. "Doyle," she said. He looked past her at the house, at the kitchen window with the wooden horse visible on the sill, at the garden, which had been brought back from the riot it had been when she arrived. His eyes moved over all of it with that practiced fluency, cataloging without appearing to, the way he cataloged everything. "You've settled in," he said. The same words Maud had used, in an entirely different voice. "What are you doing here?" Vera said. He spread his hands, a gesture of openness so well rehearsed that it had become involuntary. "I heard you were in the area. I wanted to see that you were all right." She looked at him steadily. She had learned, over 2 years and at some cost, not to fill the silences he created. Silence was a tool he used with considerable skill, and she had been slow to understand that the solution was not to speak into it, but to let it exist, which he disliked far more than anything she might actually say. He tried a different approach. "Your husband isn't here?" "He'll be back before long," she said. This was true. It was also a statement of the kind that meant something, and they both knew it. Doyle looked at her for a moment with the expression she recognized as recalibration. He was deciding which version of himself to be next. She watched the decision happening with the detached clarity that sometimes came to her now when she looked at him, as if the 2 years between them had given her a kind of sight she hadn't had before. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, which was what he said when he was here to cause trouble. "Good," Vera said. "Then there won't be any." He left without coming through the gate. She stood on the porch until the sound of his horse had faded entirely. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen with her hands on the edge of the table and breathed slowly, in and out, until the particular cold that had settled in her chest during the conversation began to ease. She heard Rafe's horse in the yard 20 minutes later. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She was at the stove, not because there was anything that needed doing at the stove, but because standing near it gave her hands something to be near. "Someone was here," he said. Not a question. She turned around. His face was entirely still, which was the face he used when something was happening beneath it that he was not yet ready to let out. He had read the yard the way he read everything, and she was standing at the stove in the middle of the afternoon for no apparent reason, and he had added these things together. She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat down at the table, and she told him, "Not everything. Not yet. But the shape of it. The real shape. The one she had been carefully not showing him since she arrived. Doyle, and who he was, and what 2 years of living close to him had done. The gradual erosion of the small certainties that a person needed to function. The way he worked not through confrontation but through accumulation, small undermining, daily and patient and invisible until it was everywhere. She spoke evenly. She had learned to speak evenly about things that were not even, had learned it the way you learn to walk on a bad ankle, carefully, with attention, because the alternative was to fall. Rafe sat across from her and did not move while she spoke. He did not ask questions. He did not offer anything. He simply listened with the full weight of his attention, which was, she was coming to understand, one of the things he did exceptionally well, one of the things that had been described to him as coldness because it was not expressive, because it did not perform itself in the ways that expression usually performed, but which was in fact the opposite of coldness. It was complete presence. It was the rarest thing she knew. When she stopped speaking, he was quiet for a moment. "You said, 'Not yet,'" he said. "When I told you that you could tell me?" "Yes." "You were waiting to understand the shape of it?" "Yes." He looked at the table, then at her. "I want you to know something," he said. His voice was even. But there was something beneath the evenness, something with structure to it, like current beneath still water. What happens in this house, and who comes to this gate, concerns me. Not because of an arrangement, because you are here, and this is your home, and that means something to me. A pause. I should have said that sooner. Vera looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the light was going amber and long, the last of the afternoon settling into the particular gold that preceded evening in this country. You didn't know me sooner, she said. No, he said. I know you now. The night the truth passed between them fully, it was raining again. Not the hard, sudden rain of before, but a steady, settled rain. The kind that had been coming since midday and showed no sign of stopping, that made the ranch feel close and warm and separate from everything outside it. Eli had gone to bed early without being asked, worn out from a full day of working with the horses in the morning and helping Vera in the garden in the afternoon, the kind of useful tiredness that led to good sleep. Rafe was at the table when she came back downstairs after checking that Eli was settled. He had the ledger open, not the original but the corrected version she had made, working through something in the far column, a pencil in his hand. He looked up when she sat across from him. You should have seen this years ago, she said, nodding toward the ledger. I know. He set the pencil down. I stopped looking closely. After a while, it felt easier to just manage what was in front of me and not think about the larger picture. That's not like you, she said. He looked at her with a slight shift in expression, something almost wry. No, it isn't. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, When did she leave? She felt the quality of the air change, very slightly. He was still for a moment, the kind of still that had decision in it. 3 years ago, near the end of summer, he said. Eli was 8. He turned the pencil over in his fingers. Not nervous, just occupying his hands while the rest of him did the harder work. She wasn't unhappy suddenly. That was what I kept not understanding. I kept looking for the thing that had changed, the specific thing that I could address or correct or at least understand. But it hadn't changed suddenly. It had been building for a long time, and I hadn't seen it, or hadn't let myself see it. He set the pencil flat on the table. She said I wasn't present, that I was in the room without being there, that she had been alone in the marriage for years. He was quiet for a moment. I think that was true, he said. I think I had been somewhere else for a long time without knowing it, after we lost the first one. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without inflection but without hiding. She was born early and she didn't stay. We didn't talk about it afterward. I didn't know how, and she needed me to, and I wasn't there in the way she needed, and eventually she stopped needing me to be. He looked at the rain on the window. By the time Eli came, I had learned to keep myself at a certain distance from things I wanted to keep. I thought I was being careful. I was being absent. There's a difference, and I learned it too late. Vera looked at him. She thought about what Maud had said, about the things his wife had told people on her way out, and she thought about how a story could be entirely true and entirely incomplete at the same time, how a person could be both wrong and wronged, and how those two things didn't cancel each other out, only made the whole thing heavier. I'm sorry, she said. Not for him, not for his wife, not for any particular thing. Just the plain acknowledgement of something that had cost a great deal. He looked at her. Then he said, Your turn. She almost smiled. Almost. She looked at the rain on the window and she thought about where to begin and decided to begin not at the beginning, but at the part that mattered most, the part she had not told anyone, the part she had carried the farthest and the longest. I didn't understand what was happening for a long time, she said. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been in it. You think that if something is wrong, you will see it clearly, but it doesn't happen clearly. It happens in small increments. One day you notice that you check his expression before you say something. Then you notice that you have been checking his expression for so long that you've forgotten how to speak without doing it first. Then one day you realize you've gone 3 weeks without saying anything that was entirely your own thought, everything filtered, everything modified, everything measured against how it will land. She paused. That's the part that frightened me most. Not what he did or said, the person I was becoming around him, the shrinking of it. The rain made its steady sound against the glass. My father's notebook, she said. That was the last thing I held on to. He left it for me specifically. It had nothing to do with anything Doyle wanted. It was just mine. And the night I almost left it behind, the night I nearly put it down because he was watching and I didn't want the confrontation, I looked at it sitting there on the bed and I thought, if I leave that behind, there will be nothing left that is only mine. She looked at her hands. I picked it up. That was when I knew I had to go. Rafe was very still across the table. You didn't leave it, he said. No. And you brought it here. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full weight of that complete attention she had come to understand, and did not yet know what to do with. Good, he said. Simply. No elaboration. The single word carrying more than most sentences she had heard in the past 2 years. The rain continued. The lamp between them made its warm, unsteady light. Somewhere in the house, something settled. The sound old houses make in the night, wood adjusting to the temperature, familiar and unhurried. Vera looked at him across the table and felt something she had not felt in a long time and would not have been able to name quickly if asked, but which had something to do with being known, not understood exactly, which was a thing people said too easily. Known. Seen in the way that required the other person to actually look, to be patient, to not flinch at what the looking revealed. The arrangement, she said carefully. He held her gaze. Is changing, he said. Not a question, not a proposal, just the plain statement of what was true. Yes, she said. Another silence, this one different from all the silences before it. Not empty and not careful. It was the silence of two people who have said the important things and are allowing them to exist between them, unhurried, in the particular intimacy of a kitchen late at night with rain on the glass, and a child sleeping upstairs, and the lamp burning low. Then Rafe reached across the table, not toward her hand, just to the center of the table where the ledger was, and he closed it. The gesture meant nothing in itself, but the way he did it, with a kind of deliberate finality, as if closing one set of accounts so that another could be opened, made something catch in Vera's chest. She looked at the closed ledger. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything else that night, but she did not go upstairs for a long time, and neither did he. And the lamp burned down until it guttered, and they lit another one. And outside, the rain came steadily down over Grey Hollow, and the land absorbed it without question, the way land absorbs what it is given, slowly, and all the way to the root. The cold came back into the house on a Monday. Not the cold of weather, though the mornings had been getting sharper, the kind of sharpness that came before the season turned in earnest. This was the other kind, the kind that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of a man who had opened something, and then, in the days that followed, found reasons to step back from it. Not cruelty, not anger, just distance, resumed like an old coat, familiar enough to put on without thinking. Vera noticed it the way she noticed most things now, quietly and without announcement. The coffee cup placed on the table rather than set near her hand. The conversation at dinner that addressed the practical things and stopped there. The way Rafe looked out the window when she spoke instead of at her, not dismissively, not unkindly, just elsewhere. The specific elsewhere of a man who had said more than he was comfortable having said, and was recalibrating the distance. She understood it. She did not like it, but she understood it. A person who had been taught by experience that openness led to loss would not move easily into the open country of feeling without pulling back at least once. That was not weakness. That was the scar tissue of an old wound, and scar tissue did not stretch the way undamaged skin did. She gave him the distance. She told herself she was being patient, which was true. She told herself she was respecting his pace, which was also true. She did not tell herself the third thing, which was that the cold reminded her of something she had been trying to stop being reminded of, and that somewhere in her chest the old reflex was waking up. The reflex that said, make yourself smaller, take up less space, disappear before you are made to. She was aware of it. Awareness was what she had instead of certainty, and she held on to it the way she held on to her father's notebook, tightly and with intention. Eli felt the change, the way children feel weather, in some register below speech. He became watchful. He ate his meals with his eyes moving between the two adults in the quiet, measuring way of someone who had seen this kind of quiet before, and knew that the question was not whether something was wrong, but whether it would get worse. On the third day of it, he brought the wooden horse from the kitchen windowsill and set it on the table between them at dinner. Neither adult spoke. Eli ate his bread. The horse stood between them in the lamplight, its chipped ear and worn flanks entirely indifferent to the weight of what was happening around it. After dinner, when Eli had gone upstairs, Vera picked up the horse and held it, and looked at it for a long time. She put it back on the windowsill. Then she went to find Rafe. He was in the barn, not working, just standing near the stall where the young mare was kept, one hand on the top rail, looking at the horse in the particular way of someone who is not really seeing what they are looking at. The lamp hung on the post made warm, unsteady light, and outside the night was very dark and very still. She stood beside him, not close, but present. For a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, without turning, "I'm doing it again." She waited. "The thing she said I did." His voice was level. The levelness cost something. She could hear the cost in it. "I can feel myself doing it, and I can't seem to stop." "You're afraid," Vera said. Simply, not an accusation. "Yes, one word," said the way he said all important things, without ornament, without escape. "So am I," she said. He turned then and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the thing between them that had been trying to become something for weeks was visible now in a way that it had not quite been before. Not hidden, not performed, just there, real and uncertain and asking nothing except to be acknowledged. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. They stood in the barn with the lamp between them and the horse, watching from the stall, and the night settled over the roof, and they looked at each other with the honest, exhausted look of two people who have stopped pretending, at least for this moment, that they were not in the middle of something. "I don't know how to do this without getting it wrong," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I've been getting it wrong for years. So have you." She paused. "I don't think that disqualifies us. I think that might be the only thing that qualifies us." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the horse in the stall, and something in his shoulders, some architecture of tension that had been there since Monday, settled slightly downward. "All right," he said, quietly, the way he agreed to things he meant. They walked back to the house in the dark, not together exactly, but close, and the coldness in the house was not entirely gone when they came back into the kitchen, but it had changed in quality, become something more like weather than like winter, something that would pass. Doyle came on a Friday. This time he did not stop at the gate. Vera heard the horse first, and then the boots on the porch, and she was already turning from the window when the knock came. 3 even raps that managed to be simultaneously polite and presumptuous. The knock of a man who expects to be admitted. She went to the door and opened it, and there he was on the porch in the pale morning light, his hat in one hand, and his expression arranged into the version of itself that meant he had decided on a particular approach and had dressed for it. "Vera." The same tone as before. The tone that treated their history as something shared and comfortable rather than what it actually was. "He's not here," she said. "I know." He said it without apology. He had waited, she understood, for a time when Rafe would not be here. He had watched the patterns of the ranch long enough to know when that was. The understanding of that, the patience required for it, moved through her like cold water. She did not step back from the door. "What do you want, Doyle?" He looked past her into the house, briefly, the way he always looked past people, into the things behind them. "I want to talk. Just talk. I think there are some things between us that have been left untidy, and I'd like to straighten them out." "There's nothing untidy," she said. "I left. I'm here. There's nothing to straighten." He looked at her with the expression she had never found a precise name for, the one that was disappointed and patient and slightly contemptuous all at once. The expression that had taken her months to understand was not a reflection of her failure, but a tool of his management. "You took things when you left," he said. "I took what was mine. That's a matter of perspective." "No," she said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on, which meant he had decided the genial approach was not going to serve and was moving to something else. "People in this town are starting to trust you," he said. "That's a fragile thing. Trust. It depends so much on what people know about a person and what they don't know." There it was. She had been waiting for it, and it still arrived with weight. "Are you threatening me?" she said. "Or are you threatening me?" Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite surprise, but the near neighbor of it. She had not spoken to him like this before. She had not had the ground to stand on. She looked at herself standing in the doorway of this house, her hand on the frame, the kitchen behind her with its lamp and its ledger and its windowsill horse, and she understood that the ground had changed without her noticing exactly when. "I'm making an observation," Doyle said carefully, "about how things work." "I know how things work," she said. "I watched you work them for 2 years. I understand the mechanics perfectly." She kept her voice even. Her father's voice, she thought. The voice he used when he was telling a patient something they needed to hear and did not want to. Whatever you think you have to use it. But understand that I'm not afraid of you the way I was, and I'm not going to become that again. You can say whatever you want to, whoever you want in this town. The people here know who I am. They know it because I have been here, and I have worked, and I have been present. That is not a fragile thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Rafe Callum doesn't know you the way I do. No, she said. He knows me differently. He knows who I am now. You knew who I was when I was trying to disappear. She held his gaze. Those are not the same person. She closed the door. She stood on the inside of it with her hand flat against the wood, feeling her own heartbeat against her palm, fast and present and real. She heard his boots on the porch. She heard his horse. She heard the gate, and then the road, and then nothing. She stood there for a while longer. Then she went to the kitchen and sat down and put both hands on the table and breathed in and out until the shaking in her hands stopped. She did not tell Rafe when he came back. She told herself she was waiting for the right time, which was true. She also did not want to see on his face the expression she had seen before on men's faces when they were told that something troubling had happened in their absence, the expression that was concern and guilt, and the particular male discomfort of having failed to be present for the thing that required presence. She did not want that from him. She was not sure what she wanted yet, only that it was not that. But the keeping of it changed the air in the house the way kept things always do, subtly, in ways that were not visible but were felt. Rafe felt it. She knew he felt it because he watched her more carefully than usual, with the attention of a man who is reading a landscape for weather and cannot quite make out what he is seeing. He did not ask. He had told her that she could tell him when she was ready, and he meant it. And he kept it, which was both a relief and its own particular ache because the patience he was extending her made the keeping feel worse rather than better. On the third day after Doyle's visit, Eli disappeared. Not truly disappeared. He had gone to Maud Rennie's property on the other side of the East Ridge, which he had done before without incident, a path he knew, and a distance that was manageable in an afternoon. But he had not come back by the time the light started to fail, and Rafe came in from the far pasture to find Vera at the kitchen window watching the ridge with her arms crossed and the stillness of someone who has been watching for some time. He read the kitchen in one pass. He read her in one look. "How long?" he said. He should have been back 2 hours ago. He was already back out the door. Vera was behind him, pulling her coat from the hook, and she heard him call back over his shoulder something that might have been "stay here," but did not stop to confirm it because she was not staying anywhere. They took the horses. The path over the East Ridge was steep enough to require attention in the fading light, and they rode it in the particular focused silence of two people managing terrain and fear simultaneously. The fear not spoken because speaking it would use energy needed elsewhere. They found Eli at the bottom of the far slope, sitting on a rock with Maud Rennie's dog beside him, unhurt, entirely calm, watching their approach with the expression of someone who had known they were coming and had been waiting. He had twisted his ankle on the way back and sat down to wait rather than risk the path in the dark. Vera reached him first. She got down from the horse and went to him without speaking and ran her hands over the ankle the way she assessed everything, quickly and with purpose, checking the range of movement and the location of the pain. and Eli sat still and let her and watched her face. "It's not broken," she said. "It will hurt tomorrow." "I know," Eli said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He looked back at her with those green-gray eyes that saw everything. "You weren't scared," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I knew you'd come," he said. Something happened in Vera's chest that she did not have immediate words for. She looked at this boy who had been 8 years old when his mother left, who had nodded once and said nothing, and spent 3 years learning how to not need. And she thought about the small hand placed on top of hers at the kitchen table, and the wooden horse set between the adults at dinner, and the simple, stated certainty of "I knew you'd come," which was not nothing, which was in fact one of the larger things she had been given in a long time. She looked up. Rafe was standing a few feet away, holding both horses, and he was looking at her and Eli with the expression she had seen on his face only once before, in the barn when she told him she was afraid, and he said he was too. The expression that was not guarded and not performed, but simply his face, the face beneath the face, open and unmanaged and more than she knew how to look at directly for very long. She looked back at Eli. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Eli said, with the dignity of an 11-year-old who has decided that dignity is the thing to have here. She helped him up. That night, after Eli was settled and the horses were seen to, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that follows a fright that turned out fine, Vera came downstairs and found Rafe at the table. She sat down. She told him about Doyle. All of it. Not the version she had given him before. The shape of it. The general outline of what those 2 years had been. The specific version. Doyle on the porch. What he had said. What she had said back. The door she had closed and stood behind with her hand against it and her heart loud in her ears. She told it the way she had learned to tell true things. Steadily and without reaching for effect. Letting the weight of it carry itself. When she finished, Rafe sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at a point above her head for a moment, the way he looked at things he was thinking through carefully. Then he said, "You closed the door." "Yes." "You told him what you told him?" "Yes." He was quiet again. Then, "Why didn't you tell me that night?" She looked at her hands. "Because I had just done something I hadn't known I was capable of, and I wanted to hold on to it for a little while before it became part of someone else's knowledge." She paused. "And because I didn't want you to feel like you had failed to be here." "You didn't fail. I handled it. I needed to know that I could." He was very still across the table. "I don't know what I expected you to say," she said, "but I should have told you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that did not have a simple name, something compounded, part recognition and part something older and more complicated, the look of a man receiving information that changes the shape of what he thought he understood. "He'll come back," Rafe said. "I know. Not to the porch again. He knows that didn't work. He'll try something else." He said it flatly, without drama, the way he said things that were problems to be managed, not catastrophes to be feared. What does he want, finally? What is the thing underneath everything else? Vera thought about it. "To not be refused," she said. "He's not a man who accepts being told no. The specific thing he wants keeps changing. The thing underneath never does." Rafe nodded once. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a moment, his hands in his back pockets, his shoulders carrying whatever he was thinking without letting it spill. Then he turned around. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it as what it is, not as what I said at that table the first night, because it isn't the same thing. She waited. This is your home, he said, not because of an arrangement, because you are here, and because of who you have been here, and because Eli put that horse between us at the dinner table and looked at both of us like we were people he had chosen to belong to. He paused. His voice was even, but the evenness carried something now that it had not carried in the early weeks, something warmer and less careful. Whatever Doyle Ashwood wants or tries, he is dealing with something different than what he thinks he's dealing with. He thinks he's dealing with you alone. He isn't. Vera looked at him standing in the lamplight at the window of his kitchen, this man who had written a letter that said, "I am not looking for love," and meant it, and was now standing here being honest about what had become true in the weeks since. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I'm going to fight back this time. Not because I'm not afraid. I am. But I'm not going to become smaller again. Whatever comes next, that isn't going to happen." "I know," he said. And then, for the first time, he almost smiled, that particular not quite smile that she had been learning to read. "I'd have been surprised if you'd said anything else." They stood in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the night outside and the house quiet around them, and the arrangement that had been signed at that same table on her first night was so far behind them now that it felt like something from a different story, a story that this one had grown out of and left behind the way a plant leaves behind its seed. Then from outside, just barely audible above the wind, came the smell. Smoke. They both moved at the same moment, through the door and into the yard, and from the far edge of the property, near the winter feed storage, a glow was visible against the dark sky, orange and unsteady, the specific, unmistakable light of something on fire. Rafe was already running. Vera went for the water, the way they had learned in the rain weeks ago, to move around each other in an emergency, without instruction, each taking the part of the problem that needed taking. She was fast, cutting across the yard to the pump in the stored barrels, calling to the neighboring property's direction on the chance that anyone was within range to hear. By the time she reached the storage building, Rafe was already at the near edge of the fire with the first bucket. The building itself was not fully caught. The fire had started at the exterior wall, set not accidentally, the pattern of it clear even in the chaos of managing it, but it had not yet reached the stored feed inside. They worked. There was nothing else to do but work. No time for fear or anger or anything except the immediate focused labor of containing what could be contained. And they worked with a synchrony that had been building between them for weeks, each aware of where the other was, each moving to cover what needed covering, back and forth with buckets, and then the wet blankets that smothered what the water could not reach. It took an hour. When it was over, they stood in the wet dark with the smoke still rising from the blackened wall and the smell of it sharp in the night air. And Vera's arms were shaking with the effort of the last stretch, and Rafe's face was black with smoke, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Rafe said very quietly, "It was set." "Yes," she said. He looked at the wall. His jaw was tight, that particular tightness that in another man might have preceded shouting, but in him preceded something else, something colder and more directed. "The feed is mostly intact," she said. "Yes." A pause. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No." Rafe turned from the wall and looked at her, his face still dark with smoke and his expression entirely clear. But he's made an error. She waited. He thinks this will make us afraid, Rafe said. He doesn't understand that he's just told me something useful. He's telling me he's out of other options. A man who burns something in the dark is a man who's tried everything else first. He looked at the scorched wall one more time. He has less than he thinks he has. Vera stood in the dark and the smoke and looked at this man who had written, "I am not looking for love." And she thought, here is what he is. Here is what was underneath the careful distance and the rehearsed honesty and the wall that his wife had called coldness, and Maud Rennie had called carefulness. Here was what lived in him when there was a real thing to protect. Not heat, not noise, just the plain, deep, completely reliable fact of him, standing in a burned yard at the end of a difficult night, looking at a problem and finding in it not defeat, but information. She did not say any of this. It was too large for the moment, and the moment was already full. She said, "We should get cleaned up." He looked at her, the not quite smile again, brief and real. "Yes," he said. They walked back to the house in the dark, and behind them the smoke rose in a pale column against the sky. And somewhere in the town of Grey Hollow, a man was learning that the thing he thought he had been dismantling had not been dismantled, had in fact been building the whole time, becoming something solid enough to stand in a burned yard without flinching. And he did not yet know what that meant for him, but he would. Maud Rennie came the next morning before the breakfast dishes were cleared. She came with the covered dish, as she always did, but this time she also came with a leather satchel, which she set on the table with a certain deliberateness before she sat down. Vera looked at the satchel. Maud looked at the scorched wall visible through the kitchen window. "I heard," Maud said. "Word moves fast," Vera said. "It always does. That's the thing about small places." Maud poured her own tea without waiting to be asked, which was one of her consistent qualities. "I've been keeping something," she said. "I've been keeping it for some time, waiting to understand when it would be needed." She opened the satchel. Inside were papers, a collection of them, written in different hands on different kinds of paper, accumulated over what appeared to be years. Statements, accounts, the recorded words of people who had encountered Doyle Ashwood in his various dealings and had found those dealings to be what they were. Not one person's experience, but many. A pattern of behavior documented by people who had each thought they were the only one. Vera looked at the papers. She looked at Maud. "You've been collecting these," she said. "Since before you arrived," Maud said simply. "There was a woman before you, not a wife, a business arrangement that he had a hand in. She left the area and no one spoke about it clearly, but I spoke to her before she left, and I wrote down what she told me." She looked at the satchel. "There have been others, not many, but enough. Enough to show that this is not a matter of one person's account, and therefore not a matter of one person's word against another's." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Why did you keep all of this?" Maud looked at her over the top of her glasses with the sharp, direct gaze that Vera had come to trust precisely because it never modulated. "Because I didn't speak up once when I should have," she said. "And I decided I wouldn't make that particular mistake twice." She closed the satchel. "These don't belong in my house anymore. They belong in yours." Vera put her hand on the satchel. Outside, through the kitchen window, Rafe was visible at the far edge of the yard, talking to one of the neighboring men who had come to look at the damage, the two of them standing in the morning light with the direct, unperformed manner of people assessing a shared problem. Vera looked at the satchel under her hand. She thought about Doyle on the porch saying trust was a fragile thing, and she thought about how wrong he was, about how he had always fundamentally misunderstood the material he was working with, had always believed that community was a resource to be managed rather than a thing that grew of its own accord between people who showed up for each other without calculation. He had come here thinking she was alone. She had not been alone for some time. She looked at Maud, who was drinking her tea with the comfortable air of someone who has done what she came to do and is in no particular hurry about the rest of it. "Thank you," Vera said. Maud set her cup down. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just let people see who you are. You've been doing that already. Keep doing it." She picked up her cup again. He'll find that the ground here isn't what he thought it was. Outside, the morning light moved across the scorched wall and made it look almost ordinary, the way the light moved over everything here, without preference, without judgment, touching what was damaged and what was whole with the same patient gold. Vera left her hand on the satchel a moment longer. Then she got up to pour more tea. Doyle Ashwood left Grey Hollow on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. There was no confrontation. There was no final scene on the road or at the gate or across a table. There was simply the information, carried by the ordinary channels of a small town, that his horse had been seen heading east before sunrise, and that the room he had been renting at the boarding house on the main street had been vacated with the particular tidiness of a man who had decided to leave before being asked to. Vera heard it from the woman who brought eggs on Tuesday mornings, mentioned in the same tone as the news that the millwright's youngest had a new tooth, and that the weather was expected to hold through the week. She stood at the kitchen door with the egg basket in her hands and received the information and thanked the woman and went back inside. She set the basket on the table. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she sat down, slowly, in the chair nearest the window, the one that caught the morning light, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. These hands that had packed a bag and held a notebook and closed a door and worked through a long, smoky night and were still, after all of it, her own. She breathed in. She breathed out. The wooden horse stood on the windowsill in the morning light, its chipped ear and worn flanks the same as they had always been, unchanged by everything that had happened around it, which was perhaps the thing about objects that outlasted the moments they witnessed. They simply remained. They did not interpret or conclude. They just held their shape. She heard Rafe's boots on the porch. He came in and looked at her and read her face the way he read everything, with quiet attention and without rushing to fill what he saw with words. "He's gone," she said. Rafe looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across the table. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at her with the full weight of that attention she had come to know and had stopped trying to deflect. "How do you feel?" he said. It was not a question he asked often. The asking of it meant something. She considered it honestly. "Lighter," she said after a moment, "and also like I've been braced against something for so long that I don't quite know what to do with my own posture." Something moved in his expression, brief and warm. "That goes away," he said. "Mostly." She looked at him. "You would know." "I would," he said. They drank their coffee. The morning light moved across the table between them, and the house was quiet around them with the deep, easy quiet of a place that had been inhabited long enough to absorb the people in it, their rhythms and their silences and their particular ways of being present. 3 days later, Eli came to find Vera in the garden. She was working the south bed, which had been her project for the past 2 weeks, clearing and replanting, making order of something that had been neglected long enough to become wild. It was satisfying work, the kind that showed its results directly and did not require interpretation. Eli stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a moment with his serious eyes. She had learned not to speak first with him, to let him come to whatever he had come to say in his own time, which was usually not long if she waited without pressure. "Is he not coming back?" Eli said. He meant Doyle. He had never used the name, but he had understood more than any of the adults had explicitly told him, because he was the kind of child who understood things through observation rather than information. "No," Vera said. "He's not coming back." Eli looked at this for a moment, turning it over. "Good," he said, with the plain directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften his positions. Vera looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Good." He was quiet for another moment. He looked at the garden, then at the barn, then at some point in the middle distance that seemed to be where he did his thinking. "Are you going to stay?" he said. The question arrived in the morning air and rested there, simply and without pressure, the way Eli asked things, as if the asking were its own complete act, and the answer would be whatever it was. Vera set down the tool she was holding. She looked at this boy, 11 years old, who had placed his small hand on top of hers at the kitchen table without looking at her, who had brought the wooden horse to dinner and set it between the people he needed to stay, who had sat on a rock at the bottom of the ridge with a twisted ankle and said, "I knew you'd come," with the certainty of someone who had decided, at some point, between then and the beginning, to believe in something again. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." He nodded once, the same nod his father used for things that were settled. Then he went back to the barn. Vera picked up her tool and went back to the garden and worked steadily through the rest of the morning, and the sun moved across the sky and the land was quiet around her, and the work went well. The foal came at the end of the week. The mare had been restless for 2 days, moving differently, eating less, carrying herself with the inward concentration of a creature attending to something important happening inside her. Vera had been checking on her morning and evening, and when she came out before first light on Friday and found the mare standing with her head low and her breathing changed, she went back for Rafe without needing to think about it. They were there when the foal arrived, both of them in the lamp-lit warmth of the stall, the smell of hay and horse, and the particular intimate intensity of a birth, which was always the same regardless of scale, always the same combination of the ordinary and the astonishing. The foal came in the gray hour before dawn, dark and wet and folded impossibly small, and then unfolding, the long legs finding their angles, the whole fragile, unlikely apparatus of a new creature testing what it had been given. Eli appeared in the barn doorway at some point during this, drawn by some instinct or some sound, and stood watching with his mouth slightly open and his whole face unguarded in a way that it rarely was, the face of a child before the face of wonder. The foal stood. It was uncertain at first, the legs taking the weight in stages, but it found its balance with the particular determination of young things, and when it stood fully, it shook its head once, and the gesture was so complete, so utterly itself, that Eli made a sound that was close to a laugh. Vera looked at him. He looked at her, then at Rafe, then back at the foal. "What do we name it?" he said. Vera thought about all the names that suggested themselves. New, again, after. The small words that carried the large things. You choose, she said. He thought about it with the serious consideration he gave to things that mattered. He looked at the foal, who had found the mare, and was nursing with the focused contentment of something that has found what it needed. Bly, Eli said. Vera looked at him. Bly, she said. It means something, he said, with the slight defensiveness of someone who has offered something real and is not certain how it will be received. Someone told me. It means gentle, and also ready. Vera looked at the foal, gentle and ready. She thought that was as good a name as she had ever heard for anything new. Bly, Rafe said behind her, and his voice carried something in it that was not the voice of the first night or the first week, or even the long weeks after. Something that had come to be there over time. Something that had no single source, but had accumulated the way the good things accumulated, quietly, through small moments and honest words and the plain evidence of showing up. They stood together in the stall, the three of them, in the lamplight and the smell of hay, watching the foal that was named for what it was, gentle and ready, and outside the sky was beginning to lighten over Gray Hollow, the first pale line of it appearing at the edge of the land where the dark and the day negotiated their daily terms. He gave her the key that evening, not with ceremony, not with a speech. He came in from the yard and set it on the table beside her hand while she was writing in her father's notebook, adding a new entry in her own handwriting below his, the two hands different, but the knowledge continuous, one generation's understanding flowing into the next. She looked at the key, small and plain, the kind of key that belonged to a gate, its metal warm from being in his pocket. She looked up at him. That's the front gate, he said. She knew which gate it was. Not the arrangement, he said. Not any arrangement. He looked at her with the open, unmanaged face she had only seen a few times, the face beneath the face. You're home, if you want it. Vera held his gaze for a moment. She thought about all the distances she had traveled to reach this kitchen, the ones measured in miles and the ones measured in other things entirely. She thought about the letter she had read on the train, the one that had said what it said without apology and had asked nothing performed. She thought about the candle burning low on the table the first night and the coffee cup placed near her hand, and the bundle of plants left without explanation and the hand on her shoulder in the dark. She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. Most true things were. I want it, she said. He sat down across from her, in the chair he always sat in, and she looked at him in the evening light, this man who had been described as cold, and had turned out to be careful, which was not the same thing, who had been absent once, and had come back to himself in the way that people came back to themselves when given sufficient reason, which was not a weakness, but its own kind of courage. She looked back down at her notebook and picked up her pen. He picked up the ledger, the corrected one, and opened it to the page he had been working on. They sat at the table in the quiet of the house, doing the ordinary work of an ordinary evening, and the lamp made its warm circle of light over both of them, and outside the last of the day settled into the particular blue that came before full dark in this country, and the land held its shape against the sky the way it always had and would continue to, patient and wide and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out on its surface, and completely altered by them at the same time. Later, in the last of the light, Vera stood on the porch. The key was in her pocket. The notebook was on the shelf in the kitchen, beside the ledger, beside the small wooden horse that Eli had placed there one morning, and that had stayed. In the barn, Bly was sleeping against his mother's side, and the other horses were settled, and Pocket was in the yard doing his evening rounds with the self-important thoroughness he brought to everything. Eli came out and stood beside her, side, not close, but present. He looked at the sky, which was doing something worth watching, the colors moving through their range. And after a while, he put his hands in his pockets, the same way Rafe did, and she saw it, and felt something move in her chest that was warm and complicated and entirely good. Rafe came out and stood on her other side. The three of them stood on the porch in the evening light and looked at the land of Grey Hollow stretching away from them, dry gold and wide, and holding the last of the sun in the tops of the grass. And the sky above it was the kind of sky that made small things feel smaller, and real things feel permanent. And the wind moved through the grass with its constant low sound, and it was an ordinary evening, entirely unremarkable, which was precisely what made it what it was. Vera put her hand in her pocket and felt the key. She kept it there, warm against her palm, and she stood between the man and the boy who had become, without her planning for it or them planning for it, the people she was staying for. And she looked at the land that was hers now if she wanted it, and she did want it, had wanted it. Perhaps since the first morning she woke to the sound of wind against glass in a room with a clean floor and a new lock and a small worn horse on the windowsill, had wanted it in the way that you want things that feel true, which was not loudly or urgently, but with a deep, quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it was not going anywhere. The light faded. The stars came out over Grey Hollow, one by one. And on the porch of the ranch that had been a house and was becoming a home, three people stood in the dark and did not move for a long time, because there was nowhere they needed to be except exactly here, and all of them, in their different ways, knew it.